Okay, so we're going to start our lecture. You're first going to start just like you would in class by logging the following into your table of contents. So we're back at it with federalism. Our second lecture is about defining federalism a little bit further, and then we're hopefully going to end on those pages. So, and again, I did put page numbers at the bottom of the page. I won't remind this with you or as we're kind of talking through the lecture. However, you do what you need to do, and if you need to move on, use your discretion. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the goals today. So today's goal is, obviously, we're going to listen to the lecture, and then you're going to complete the following two activities. The first is going to be a Google check-in quiz. The second is going to be adding defined and discussed words throughout the lecture, and there are going to be a lot of them today, to your word wall. Which was on page 82. And you also might want to add some graphics and pictures, and that will help you kind of to further define words. So that's what we're looking to do today. The check-in quiz is about 10 questions. It'll go very fast, I assure you. So make sure that you set some time to do that as well. And it might even be helpful to listen to the lecture more than once, so that you're able to, really get your word wall where you want it to be. And you can start crossing some of that off of your to-do list. Okay, our lecture 2 objectives here. So we're going to continue to define federalism. We started doing that together in class last week, but we're also going to take it kind of a step further. Today we're going to talk about the constitutional basis for what the system of government and system of power is, how power is actually divided between national and state governments. We're going to talk about the idea of national supremacy, and where that's come into play. And then we're lastly going to talk about how the states and what obligations they have to one another. But before we start, I'd like to kind of recap federalism. And I love this picture. And you might want to go back to your notes from when we first defined it and add to this, or you might want to just add it right there on page 84 for a reminder for yourself. But when we talked about federalism, we talked about it being a system of government where power is shared between the national and the state levels. And I love this picture because it sort of helps to visualize, and it sort of helps to put kind of a face, if you will, on federalism. So, the first thing that you see when you look at this picture is you obviously see the outline of the country, and then behind it, right, the symbolic American flag. But if you look a little bit closer, you see that each state is sort of carved out. Now, most times when you guys look at a map of the United States, the states are kind of the forefront there, because each state usually has like a different color and a different name. Their name is obviously in their territory. But this map kind of reverses it. It takes the country, so the nation, the national government as a whole, and it sort of highlights where the states fit into that definition. And it really always reminds me of federalism, because there's two parts in order for federalism to work, and one without the other doesn't exist. So part one is the national government, and obviously visually that's represented. But also, remember, it's a shared system of government. It's a shared division of power, and that power is divided, all right, amongst the states. So there's that careful outline of each state territory. So for those of you in my second period class, this is where we ended on page 84 on Monday, and then those of you in my fifth period rather, this is where we ended together on Tuesday. So as collectively, everyone, we started talking about intergovernmental relations. So first we defined federalism, and then we talked about the different levels of government that exist. And we talked a little bit about where we each fit in that category, and how we have so many power and government structures. I think I used the word controlling us. Maybe I should have used the phrase have authority over us. And I think I gave you guys even very specific examples of where you fit in to each scenario. So, we talked about intergovernmental relations being the set of interactions between all levels of government. and that federalism really encourages and in some ways forces government structures to share power, to work together, to find connections and meaning amongst each other, because otherwise you'd have three different sets of authorities. And the idea here is that they all sort of have their own role and they all really work together. So you also want to make mention on your note in your notes that intergovernmental relations isn't just that set of interaction, but it's sort of this combined effort, this joint effort, if you will, of excuse me, government finding a way to really work together. And we talked about taxes being an example in school policies. We talked a lot about like driving laws and things like that. So there's always somebody in charge. And for each specific issue, you kind of have to figure out who that person is. And today that will become more clear because we're going to talk a lot about different powers and things like that. Now, we also kind of briefly talked about when you have intergovernmental relations, of course, there's the good and the bad, right? Your benefits or your advantages and your disadvantages or your cons, so to speak. So, your drawbacks. So let's talk a little bit first about the advantages. So here are some of the good things that federalism brings to the table. And, when you're talking about any kind of governmental policy or structure or system, it is obviously important to know, kind of going into it, the good, the bad, and then sometimes the ugly. So we'll talk about the good first. So because there are so many levels of government in federalism, because you have, your national, your state, and then for us, we even have our local governmental structures, it does give the people more access to government. It also gives them more opportunities to participate in government. So, in some countries in the world, if you look at like a unitary system, which we talked about on Monday and Tuesday, government seems so far removed from the people. So for us, we're fairly close to DC, so we kind of see the connection on, we kind of see the connection to DC because we're fairly close to it. But think about if you're from Wyoming, okay? You maybe have never been to Washington, DC. The likelihood that any of us are going to meet the president is fairly low. But there's something in place that's controlling you. So the interesting thing about federalism is that it kind of puts government, it allows it to have a place in each of our lives. So, for some of us, depending on how close we are to the national government, that really matters. But most of us can feel connected to our individual state politicians. And then for some of us, our local politicians. So, when you live in a big city, sort of the face of your government would be your mayor. And because there are so many levels of the way American government works. You could participate as a school board member. You could participate, on your city or your town council. You could run for mayor. You could run for town manager. You could run for state members of the House or state members of Congress. You could run for governor. You could run for attorney general. All the way up the list until you hit or at the national level. So there's so many opportunities for us as citizens to participate, whether it's running, whether it's helping somebody who is running via campaigning, volunteering, working for a political party. The more levels of government that exist, the more opportunities there are for citizens to get involved. Because there's so many players involved, there's not so much pressure on the national government. In many foreign countries, where there's just, prime ministers and kings, and of course there's people helping those people to make the laws, but there's not a lot of other individuals at the local level. There's a lot of pressure and decision making forced on those people. Because there's so many different levels of government within our country, it takes a little bit of the pressure off the president. For example, Obama doesn't need to worry about, Philadelphia summer curfew laws. That's something that is not of importance to him. That's a job for the mayor. So we have these different levels of government, and it takes some pressure. It reduces the decision making, and even areas of conflict for those who serve at the national level, whose job is to make decisions that benefit the entire country. Just like the governor. The governor's not going to worry about the Philadelphia curfew law because his job is to make sure that policies and laws are being passed that benefit all members of the state. It is the mayor's job to deal with that curfew law. On the same token, if we're about to go to war, Mayor Nutter has very little concern or involvement in that decision. That's something that's going to affect the nation, and that's where we need Obama and the other members of our national government to be focused. So it sort of helps everybody kind of figure out their role, but also make sure that they're super and hyper focused on the areas where their decision making needs to be, thought through and detailed and thorough. Federalism is really cool because it also allows us to experiment, and we'll talk more about this in class next week, but, the idea, I'm going to give you one example, the idea of, legalizing marijuana in several states right now for recreational use, that can happen because states can make certain laws that benefit the members of their individual states, and when that comes into play, what it does is it allows you to pass some laws that will benefit certain members of just one state, see if it works, implement some policies, some laws, some punishments on how you want the law to run, figure out work out the kinks, and then you can implement it at the national level. But again, we'll talk more about that next week. Also, this is how we get our presidents. We train people for future levels. So, you start at mayor and then you run for governor. You don't just wake up one morning and decide you want to be president of the United States. There's a lot of steps that go into being president. And you have to work at those local levels and work at those state levels first before you can even think about having a hand at the national government. Here's some of the disadvantages. When something bad occurs at a national level, it becomes extremely difficult to deal with because nobody sometimes can really determine who's in charge. So when something like a 9/11 happens, okay, is that New York City's problem because that's where it happened? Is it the state of New York's problem? Or is it, the national government's problem? And we'll talk again more about that on Monday and Tuesday of next week as well. But that's kind of, federalism sometimes can be confusing when you're figuring out who's in charge, who's to blame. And sometimes we don't even know. And when we don't know, it makes us wonder who exactly is in charge here. So I put the who's in charge twice purposely because sometimes the levels of government themselves need to figure it out, and then sometimes us as voters feel very far removed because when some kind of crisis or issue occurs and we're not sure, it makes us feel more disconnected from government because there are so many levels. So there's a lot of pros and cons, there's a lot of goods and bads, but at the same time, while it can help us feel very connected and give us lots of opportunities to participate, it can also help us feel very disconnected because we're not really sure who fits in where and where we fit in that equation as well. On page 85, I'm going to have you draw a Venn diagram rather. So you might want to take just a moment and you can use at least half of the page for this, maybe a third for this Venn diagram. And I love this because it's really, really good at helping us to figure out the division of powers, and it does it in this really nice, clean way. So if you look, so on the left-hand side of the red part of the Venn diagram, that's where you're going to put the national government's power. And these are called express, implied, or inherent powers, and we'll talk about them in a second. And you'll be able to define those words, and they're going to go on your word wall. And this is just sort of a very basic list of things that the national government can do. So, for example, it can regulate foreign and interstate commerce. Commerce is just a fancy way of saying business. Interstate means between states. Inter, between, state, state. It can coin money. In other words, it makes, we have one national currency. We've talked about this issue before. And the national government is responsible for making sure that there is one national currency. Otherwise, we'll have problems similar to what happened under the Articles of Confederation. It provides an army and a navy, obviously, okay. That also includes Air Force, okay. That would include Coast Guard. That's sort of a division of the Navy, so to speak, okay. But it provides military forces or military services for the country. It is the national government's responsibility to declare war on foreign nations. It can establish federal courts below the Supreme Court. So we know we have the judicial branch, and that sets up the Supreme Court of our country, but we also have lower courts, we have state courts, we have local courts, we have courts before you can ever get to the Supreme Court. And the national government's responsible for sort of establishing them. Any kind of foreign relation policy, whether it's trying to work out an economic proposal with another country for trade reasons, or whether it's trying to, prevent war, whether it's trying to work out, positive governmental relations where we want allies and things like that, that's really the responsibility of the national government. And then any powers that are implied, and we'll talk about that more in a second, those are also to be exercised by the national government. So that's your national government powers. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, or the blue circle, those are your state powers, and these are often called reserve powers. So these are powers reserved for the state. And these are, and then on the opposite side, you had express powers of the national government. And here's a helpful way to remember that. The national government's powers are expressed in the national constitution or the U.S. Constitution, and the state government powers are reserved for the states in the state constitution. So that always helps me kind of remember. So let's go back to the states. We're going to go back to the big blue circle there. The job of the state is to regulate intra-state commerce, and that would be commerce within. Intra means within a state. So, those of you that live in the city, whenever you go buy something outside of the city, Montgomery County, or people that don't live in the city that come into the city and go to a show or a movie or a concert or a Phillies game, that's intra-state commerce. When you go to the Cherry Hill Mall, that's interstate commerce, because now you're leaving Pennsylvania, going to New Jersey, and you're spending your money in New Jersey. So intrastate is when you live in a state and you just visit a different location and buy something. Interstate is when you actually leave the state to purchase something else. So the job of the state government is to make sure that business and how business is regulated when people shop and spend money and create businesses within a state. They also establish all the local governmental systems, so all the cities and townships and counties within a state. The state's also responsible for administering elections and being in control of the election process. So while, during elections, obviously we do elect our mayors and our township managers and our city and town councils, we also elect our state representatives and our state members of Congress and our governor, and we also elect our leaders at the national level. The state is responsible for controlling, setting up, and administering those elections and that election process. And then the biggest job of the state is to provide public welfare and safety. So our fire, our police, our different kinds of welfare systems, public welfare, also schools fall under that, right? Though your welfare, your well-being is being educated. So schools are really, states are really responsible for, our hospitals, all of the things that kind of help people to function at, help their well-being and help their safety. Now, there's also some things that both states and both the national government can do, and those are called concurrent powers. And I know in Spanish, con means with. In this sense, con means, like a joint effort. So concurrent means you can do them at the same time. So that's that center circle. And both the national and the state governments can levy taxes, so that means they can collect taxes. They can borrow money. They can spend their money for the general welfare of either the nation or their state. They can both establish courts, and they both can enact, so pass and enforce laws. So that's probably the biggest one. So there's some things that only the national government can do. There's some things that only the state government can do. And then there's things that they both can do. So we're going to talk a little bit more now about the powers of the national government. Now, there's something called express powers, and express powers are powers that are spelled out for the national government in the Constitution, and that's what was in that red circle of yours just a second ago. All of these powers are expressed in either Article 1, Section 8, so the legislative branch, Section 8 of the legislative branch, or Article 2, Section 2, so Section 2 of the executive branch. And although you don't remember, we actually read these guys together. So when at the time I didn't tell you what this was, but you were reading what the expressed powers of the national government are. And if you go back to those notes in that chart, you have a lot of them already written there. So this kind of makes sense. The powers of the national government are expressed, are written down in the U.S. Constitution in these locations. And one of the main ones here is something called the Commerce Clause, and you want to make sure you get this down. And we talked about commerce when in that previous slide. And the Commerce Clause has to do with business. So basically, the Commerce Clause means that the government has power to make laws about businesses between states. It also has the power to make sure that nobody's breaking the law in order to and not preventing businesses to occur between states. So the government can make laws that encourages business between states, but it also can make sure it can enforce the law to make sure that business between states is occurring. So that's the Commerce Clause. Then there's implied power. So when somebody says to you, like, oh, you look grumpy today, okay? It implies that you're kind of maybe not having the best attitude. So this is also, implied means kind of the same thing in this sense, okay? So implied powers, they're not necessarily written down, but they're suggested. And a great example of this is the necessary and proper clause, which is also sometimes called the elastic clause. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the year as well, so this is kind of a little recap here. But basically, what the necessary and proper clause means is that the government can do anything, the national government can do anything that's deemed necessary and proper in order to do its job as listed in the Constitution. So a great example of this has to do with coining money. Now, you need to have a banking system to coin money, but nowhere in the Constitution are you going to see them write anything about establishing a national bank. They talk about coining money, so it's implied that if you're going to coin money, that then you're going to have to establish a national bank. Another example, the government has the power to declare war. Well, it's sort of implied that if you're going to declare war, you're going to need people to fight in that war. Nowhere in the Constitution is there talk about drafting people. That was what is necessary and proper in order to declare war and then go to war. So, implied powers are not written down, but they are exercised through the necessary and proper clause. And what that does is it gives Congress sort of this elastic, this growth of power. Because it's implied, okay, they have to be able to do things that aren't specifically listed in the Constitution, but make sense under this idea of what's necessary and proper in order to run the country. Make sure you have that definition. You're going to see a lot of necessary and proper on AP exams, and you're definitely going to see it again on that midterm. And then there's something called inherent. Now, right, inherent are things that are natural. And so there's some powers that just naturally, what happened here? There are some powers that just naturally belong to the national government because it's its own nation. So there's some decisions that the national government gets to make and gets to do. Why? Because it's its own nation. So 3 sets of powers for the national government: the express, the implied, the inherent. The Commerce Clause, okay, as well as all the other powers are spelled out in Article 1, Section 8, Article 2, Section 2. Those implied powers get their power from that necessary and proper clause, right? The elastic, that growth, think of an elastic band stretching out because of the necessary and proper clause. Okay, the national government kind of stretches out, flexes its muscles, it has more power than then is expressly stated because it's implied. And then because we are our own independent nation, then we have these sort of inherent powers, these natural powers that are given to us. Now, on top of, and if you need to move on to another page, that's fine. On top of those powers is something called the Supremacy Clause. And what the Supremacy Clause really does is it expands the national government's actual power. And we talked again about this earlier in the year, so this is a little bit of review. What the Supremacy Clause says, all right, is that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so that even though federalism allows for a shared government division of power between the federal government or the national government and the states, when there are issues between and there are conflicts between the national government and the state, okay, the Supremacy Clause goes into play. National law takes precedent, okay, so comes first over state law. And you always have to follow the national law before the state law. And this kind of came to be, and the first time it was really put into practice, the first time the Supremacy Clause was actually legally used was in 1819 in a court case called McCulloch versus Maryland. And basically this is the gist of the story. So the state of Maryland had created something called the Second Bank of the United States so that it would have a way to manage its money. And the Congress, the National Congress, had opened all of these second banks of the United States. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to deal with the currency problem in the country. So they opened a branch of that Second Bank of the United States in the state of Maryland. So this is very close to D.C., of course. Now, Maryland at the time, okay, does not want to have a federal bank. So what they don't want is people to put their money into the national bank. They want people to put their money into state banks. So they make this law, state of Maryland, saying that all banks that were started outside their state had to pay extra taxes. Now you could see where that would be an issue because bright people don't like to pay taxes on things. So this was sort of a law that was trying to encourage people to not start banks in Maryland. So the second bank, started by the National Congress, was the only one that was actually affected by the law because it was the only one operating in Maryland that was started somewhere else. And the guy who was running the Second Bank of the United States at the time in Maryland's name was James McCulloch. And basically what he did was he sued the state of Maryland saying that the tax was unconstitutional, so it was against the law, and it was unfair. And the state of Maryland said, no, it's not us that's doing something unconstitutional, it's you. It doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that the government can start its own bank, and so that's technically against the law. So these two go to court against each other. Well, what the Supreme Court ends up deciding is that Congress is allowed to start banks because that is what's necessary and proper. So they use the necessary and proper clause to say it's not against the law for the United States government to start its own bank. And it needs to do that in order to run the federal government, and it serves a legitimate purpose, so it's necessary and proper. And the Supreme Court also said that because the federal government is supreme, meaning it's more powerful and has more authority than state governments, its law has precedent over the Maryland law, and what that meant was that the state of Maryland was not allowed to tax the federal government, and the tax on that bank, on the federal government's bank, the Second Bank of the United States, was deemed unconstitutional or against the law. And this case was really, really important because it was the first to explain what the idea of what implied powers were, but it also helps to reinforce this idea of supremacy and help to create that balance between the state and federal government. And the actual sort of formal writing was that, and the ruling was that the states have no power to retard, impede, burden, or in any manner control the operations of the constitutional law enacted by Congress. So in other words, the states have no power to impede, to prevent, to burden, to stop how Congress operates the law under the Constitution. So it was the state of Maryland that was in trouble for taxing the national government and basically kind of encouraging them not to conduct business in their state. Okay. Also, the war power. Right, the war power kind of helps to expand the national government. A lot of people think the president is the one who declares war. A lot of people think the president is the most powerful person. Really, we know it's Congress. Congress has the sole power to declare war. It also gives us the money to go to war. It approves the budget to go to war. And then we talked already a little bit about interstate commerce and how it encourages business between states and therefore boosts the economy. And that sort of expands the power, flexes the muscles a little bit more of the national government. If you're not already on page 86, you're going to want to go to it. Today we're going to talk here about the powers of the state. And we've talked about all of these things before, so these are just straight review. So Article 4 talks about interstate relationships, and it talks about the full faith and credit clause, it talks about the policy of extradition, and it talks about privileges and immunities. So full faith and credit is the idea, and you guys can go back through your notes and look at this. Full faith and credit is the idea that your records, your licenses in one state are valid in another. So your driver's license, even though it's going to be Pennsylvania, you can drive anywhere in the United States, and if you get pulled over, all right, you wouldn't be arrested for illegally driving because the state of Pennsylvania and all of the other 49 states recognized each other's driver's licenses. Same thing for, your marriage licenses, right? John and I just got married in Pennsylvania in Montgomery County, but if we move to another state, they will still recognize us as being married. Extradition, if you commit a crime in one state, they will extradite you. They will send you back to the state in which you are wanted or committed the crime in. And I think I gave you guys that example about John and the guy in the plane that they arrested and all of those things we talked about earlier in the year. And then the privileges and immunities. So you have the privileges and immunities of the state that you live in, but when you travel outside of your state, you have to adhere to the laws of the new state that you're currently in. All right. So we talked about all three of those things, but it might be helpful to go back through them in your notebook as well. We also did talk briefly about the 10th Amendment, but I do want to recap that one again for you. Basically, what the 10th Amendment says is that if it's not written down in the Constitution, so if it wasn't specifically granted to the national government as a power, take for example declaring war, then that power is automatically reserved for the states. So in the Constitution it says very specifically that the national government is responsible for declaring war. So that is not a reserved power. But it says nothing in the Constitution about schools or education. The word school does not exist in the U.S. Constitution. So that power is solely reserved for the state. So if the job has not been granted to the national government via the Constitution, then you should automatically assume that that power is reserved for the states. And that's why it's so important that you know what Article 1, Section 8 and Article 2, Section 2 say, because that will help you determine whether or not it's a government or national government power or state power. So speaking of powers and laws and policies, what can the states actually do? Well, marriage age is one, okay? So there can be different age where you're permitted to marry in different states. Most states in the country are 18, and some of them even allow you to marry younger if you have, certain permission or something like that. Sale of pornography is one. whether or not gambling is permitted or prohibited. So obviously in Vegas, it's cool. In certain places in Pennsylvania, it's okay. And certain practices of gambling are okay. So it's not okay to do, like you can do horse racing, but you couldn't bet on, like other things, like college basketball or something like that. But if you were in Vegas, you absolutely could. Internet gambling is a whole other thing. So the permitting or the prohibiting of gambling is another. Professional licenses, so I have my teaching license, and that allows me to practice teaching in 42 other states, but there's 8 states that won't accept it. So how a state gives you your professional license or the requirements for it are different state to state. Same thing with driver's license, motorcycle license, truck driver's license, doctor licenses, lawyer licenses, etc. Public schools are run differently state to state. It's up to the state to decide the kinds of curriculum, the kinds of standards that they want to set for their public schools. Land utilities, states are allowed to own certain utility companies. So PECO, for those of you who have, Pennsylvania Energy Company, that's where you get your electric. That's operated. PGW is the Philadelphia Gas Works. That's still operated through the state oversees that. It's owned by the city of Philadelphia, but it's operated through the state. Drinking age. The drinking age can technically vary state to state. It just does not. So technically speaking, theoretically, every state could have its own drinking age, but it would lose federal funding. So we all all the states have agreed for it to be 21. But that is, there's nowhere in the Constitution does it say anything about legal age for drinking. It talks about voting, but it does not talk about drinking. So that's something that the states decided amongst themselves. Okay. Powers denied. So what are some of the things that states can't do? Well, the national government and the states, this slide goes through the things that both groups can't do. So the national government, they can't violate the Bill of Rights. They can never take away your freedom of speech, the right to bear arms, the search and seizure clause, due process, the right to speedy and public trial, cruel and unusual punishment, etc. So the national government may not violate the Bill of Rights. They may not impose taxes among the states. So they do not impose export taxes for, in other words, the national government encourages people to cross state lines to buy things. That's a good thing in our country, and you won't be taxed for doing that. Now, you're going to be taxed when you buy something within that individual state, but when you come back to your state, the national government can't tax you on that. They can't just take money from the national treasury without it going somewhere, and that going somewhere has to be passed through a bill. So when they declared war, the Second World War, and we're going to go to war against Germany and Japan, obviously that costs money. Well, that money had to be approved, and it was passed through a specific bill in order for that money to be used to fight, the Nazis and the Japanese. They cannot change the state boundaries. They cannot decide to give, Rhode Island some of Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, some of New York. The boundaries and the territories that have already been set up are in place and cannot be changed. Now, at the same time, the state governments can't do things as well. They can't enter into treaties with other nations. So the governor of, Chris Christie in New Jersey cannot go over to Israel and set up a treaty with the Israelis. That's against the law. He's not allowed to do that. They can't print their own money. We already talked earlier in the year about how big of a problem that is. They cannot impose their own import or export taxes. They also can't suspend a person's right without due process. They also can't take away someone's right to legal counsel, a speedy and public trial, being notified of the crimes that you're being convicted or accused of, facing the people that are accusing you. They can't take away, those 5th, 6th, 7th Amendment rights. They also can't violate the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment. They can't prevent somebody from voting because of race or creed, okay, or color. They cannot allow slavery. Okay, they have to give everybody who fits under certain qualifications legal citizenship in the country. So the states can do things, the national government can do things, they can do things together, and then there are things they both can't do. So you've talked about implied powers, express powers, inherent powers, reserved powers, concurrent powers, and now you've talked about powers that have been denied. So here are things the states can do, here's things the states can't do. That's the end of this lecture, so it wasn't that long. And now you're going to want to go and do that check-in quiz. And make sure that you submit it if you're in my second period class before Monday morning class. I'm going to give you a little extension because there was trouble uploading the lecture. And if you are in my fifth period class, I'm sorry, I messed that up. If you're in my fifth period class, I see you guys on Monday, so make sure that it's completed before Monday morning, before school starts. And then if you are in my 2B class, I won't see you until Tuesday, so make sure that you have it done before you come in on Tuesday morning. Any questions, of course, you can always email me and I'll get back to you. Enjoy!